a side note, I told my boss when he hired me, making the American guy's first day at work, the 4th of July, feels like a bit of a shot. But so if you're new to my channel, I'm an American. I moved to Sydney, Australia just over 2 years ago when I was 28 years old, and I've lived here for 2 years. I've been working here now for 1 year, and I thought I would talk about, having now worked here for 1 year, the sort of differences I've noticed in working culture, work-life balance, things of that nature. Now, I'm going to make a caveat to this, because I don't want this to be taken as gospel. I have only worked for one company here. I've been working at the same company for 1 year, but I got promoted across departments, so the first 6 months I worked at this company, I worked in one department for one boss, and these last 6 months I worked in a completely different department with a different boss, and my boss has different bosses above him. I wasn't dealing with those people at all prior to moving departments. So although I've only worked at one company, I've worked under 2 different management groups. And for comparison, looking at my work history in the United States, my first job, I worked at an Albertsons, which I realize not everybody will have an Albertsons. It's like a Walmart, Fred Meyer, Kroger, that sort of thing. I worked in the deli. I made fried chicken. So that was my first job. And then I worked at the Adidas employee store in Portland. I don't know if you know this, but Adidas is headquartered in Portland, Oregon. They have their big campus there, although I think they have moved their campus to a different part of the city since I have left. But I worked at the employee store, mostly at the warehouse, the employee store warehouse, but I worked a little bit on the retail side as well. And I worked for a school district for a little while. I worked at a bank as a customer service agent, basically a call center, for a little while. And then the 2 things I did the longest, I was an independent contract videographer and editor. Although I was basically working for myself during that time period, so I can't really count that as freelance. And then there was a time where I worked for a company that did live streams of AAU basketball games. But again, that was very, not freelance, but it was very unconventional. So I'm mainly going to be looking at those more conventional jobs that I worked in the States compared to here, and my work life here. And the first thing that really stood out to me was the work culture and the work-life balance. And there was actually a point, and my wife could tell you that early on I was like, man, I'm gonna get fired. Like, this seems too good to be true. Like, there's like no pressure on me. Like, I feel like I'm like, I don't know, it just seemed like, I guess, too good to be true or whatever, but there was no sort of micromanagement. I was very much so, in many ways, left to my own devices and given a lot of autonomy, and even more so now in my new role than I was prior in my old role. There was nobody indicators. There's nobody breathing down my neck every second of the day, making sure that I was on task. And that's not to say that I was like, being unproductive or goofing off, but like, if I had to take a personal phone call, if I had to respond to a personal text, that was never an issue. Nobody raised an eyebrow. Neither of my managers have been clock watchers. I take an extra 5-10 minutes of my lunch break one day. Nobody says anything about it. Things happen. If I come in 2 or 3 minutes late because traffic was bad, nobody says anything about it, unless I'm like making a habit of it. But there's sort of an acceptance of little mistakes. And I remember, so even though I really did love my job at Adidas, it was one of my favorite, probably my second favorite job I've ever had of my traditional workplace jobs. They had a very strict, 5 strikes policy, where if you clocked in late, even if it was 1 minute late, if you came in late from your lunch break, even if it was 1 minute late, anything like that, 5 times in a rolling a rolling calendar year, you were terminated, no questions asked. And that was one thing because, at the time, I was a younger kid. I was in my early 20s when I worked there. So the only things making me late was sleeping in or having hangovers. But especially now, thinking about it as an adult, and I'm 30 now, about to be 31, and all my coworkers, there's kids, there's appointments, there's obligations, and my boss now, he regularly comes in 30-45 minutes late, and he doesn't, nobody says anything to him. But then there's also that allowance that he wouldn't say anything to us. There's been days where, actually this happened today, the day I'm recording this. One of my coworkers, she had a dentist appointment, and she was like, hey, I have to go to the dentist. Is this gonna be, maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes? And you're like, oh yeah. And she didn't, clock out. She didn't lose her lunch break. She didn't get penalized on her work hours or whatever. She just, in the middle of her shift, went to the dentist, came back, and it was part of her work day. Because there's a sort of allowance that you're a person with a life, and again, at least in my experience in the workplaces I had back home, that there were not leeways afforded, especially when I worked at the bank. That the bank was my most miserable job. I'm up for a pay rise at the moment, and once I get my pay rise, I will be earning the most money I've ever earned. But previous to that, the most money I ever earned was at the bank. But I did not last long at the bank, regardless of the money, because it was such a miserable working experience, and the management and the KPIs and all that stuff was absolutely a factor in that. In fact, from what I remember, the average turnover rate at that bank was about 2 weeks. Most employees last 2 weeks. And we had 1 week of training. So that means the average employee did their 1 week of training, worked for a week, and then quit. Because that's how miserable it was. I lasted a bit longer than that. I worked there about a year. But it was legitimately one of the worst years of my life. And there was no affordances, no anything whatsoever for any of that. I remember the day that I quit my job at the bank. It was basically a, quit or we'll fire you type of situation. But you might be aware of this if you lived in the United States, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. Quite a few years back now, probably 6-7 years now at this point, which is when I worked there. There was quite a bad snowstorm. And the rule at the center was like, if the bank is open, then you're expected to be there. And there was this really bad blizzard, snowstorm, all this stuff. Now at the time, I was still living at home with my parents. I was probably 24, 25 at the time. And my parents lived probably 45 minutes outside of Portland, Oregon, the city. I say I'm from Portland, really. I'm outside of Portland, but I don't want to get into the weeds of it. And they lived in a rural area, so at my parents' house, you drove out into the middle of nowhere, and then you kept driving a little bit more into the middle of nowhere, and then you drove about halfway up a mountain. So they were well above the snow line, like well above. We got that winter, probably got over a foot of snow. We were well and truly snowed into the house. But you know, but the center was open. But the reason the center was open was because they brought in snow plows, they salted the roads, they did this, that, and the other to open. But I know my manager, I'm like, listen, I live at 3,000 feet, whatever it was. I don't know how many feet it was. I have about a foot of snow right now, and I even sent him a picture of, what was going on with my driveway. I was like, there's no way I can safely get to work, if I tried to drive in this, this weather, I might crash, and I might, get pretty seriously injured. And quite a few people that winter actually did crash on my road in my parents' neighborhood up there, so it wasn't an unfounded fear. And there was no understanding whatsoever. He's like, well, the center's open, you need to be here. And I was like, so you're telling me I need to risk my life to come into the center? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, alright, well, disrespectfully, F you, this job sucks, you're a terrible manager, and I hate working there, so see you later. Basically, was my email response to that. And that was super micromanaging. Every little thing you were doing in that place was someone was breathing down your neck, somebody was double, triple checking everything you were doing, and basically everybody was treated like they were a child who didn't know what they were doing, and they were trying to break the rules at all times. It was a very uncomfortable work environment. Whereas I think about that now with my current boss, and it would have been either of them, but even now, because my boss now reports directly to the CEO, and almost every day I'm talking directly to the CEO of my company. He comes into my office. We are on a first name basis, like this, that, and the other. He's really friendly with me. We've chatted about all sorts of stuff. And I could go to my boss and I could say, not that would ever happen in Australia, but if I send that, he'd be like, you know what, yeah, take as much time as you need, it's not even a question. And I could tell the CEO, and the CEO would probably tell me, if I see you at work, you'll be in trouble, if he knew the sort of situation I was in. And I think back to earlier this year, there was a time period where I got pretty sick over the weekend, a head cold, coughing, sneezing, runny nose. But we had a really big presentation on the Monday, so I got sick probably Friday afternoon, Friday night, and then Saturday and Sunday I got progressively sicker. And then on the Monday, we had this big 6-hour meeting where we were meeting with the COO, the Chief Operations Officer, and a couple of the other department heads, and basically presenting them this is where we're at for the first half of this year, and this is where things are looking like for the second half of this year, and this is what we want to do, and this is what we're kind of forecasting for the first half of 2026, kind of really getting into some strategic planning. And it was a 6-hour meeting, and went in there on Monday, and I was sick as a dog, and basically presented this thing to these very important people in the business that I had been preparing. It was very well received. They were very happy about it. And what's funny is actually earlier today, we had another big sort of strategic planning session, and the COO sort of gave us a document saying okay, this is what we're doing. And basically everything in that document was based off the data that I provided in that 6-hour meeting. But I suffered through it, and my manager after, on Monday, that was basically our entire day. It was just that one meeting. That was all I did that day. But at the end of that day, my manager came to me. He's like, hey, I know you put a ton of work into that presentation, and you did a really good job, but you're super sick. Take the rest of the week off. And so I took the rest of the week off, and I got paid for the rest of the week, and it did not take up my sick leave or my annual leave or anything. He just gave me the days off and paid me those days like I had worked them. And I did a little bit of work from home here or there if there was something he needed me to do, maybe only 2 hours over the rest of that week. But I don't think any of my previous workplaces would have ever in a million years approached me with that. But I find here in Australia, the work-life balance is really respected. I've never had anybody contact me outside of work hours unless it was an urgent matter. There was one thing. It was because it was literally an urgent matter, and I fixed it, and that was literally the only time. And there's always this give or take. My boss always tells me if you accommodate me, I'll accommodate you. And I feel a lot of workplaces in the States will tell you they'll be accommodating, but it's a one-way street in my experience. You give, and you try to provide for them, but they don't give you that in return. We have this big event at work next Monday. I'll be staying an extra 4 hours after my usual scheduled time. I'll be staying 4 hours late to cover this big event. So I'll be working a 12-hour day that day. My boss has already told me, just take the next day off. So that's obviously working 8-hour shifts. And that's basically just a free 4 hours I'm getting there. And there's always the flexibility to work from home, all this other stuff. My bank job, I very easily could have done that work from home. There were 2 people in our entire bank center who were work from home. They were very senior people. Nobody else was afforded that opportunity. Now it's not even a question if I want to do work from home days. Yeah, just go for it. I don't even have to tell them. And I find and again, this is just my experience, but from working with, talking with, because I work with one other American guy. There's one other American guy at my workplace, and him and I have talked about this in depth. We used to work in the same department. We don't anymore, so we don't talk as much anymore, but we used to talk about this for hours, how different it is. And he was telling me he felt the same thing early on. He said the first couple of months that he was working, he was kind of is something wrong? Am I doing something wrong? And he sort of felt the same thing I did. Am I about to be fired? Cause, but it really does truly just seem, and I feel I'm only just now kind of starting to adjust to the new, it's starting to become sort of a new normal for me. But then I'll talk to some of my friends back home, and they'll tell me oh, my boss did this, or this is happening at work, and I'm kind of oh my god, I totally forgot that this is just sort of a thing. And the other thing is because I know in the States there's the 401k, but not every employer offers a 401k. Only one of my jobs ever did offer a 401k, and I don't know what determines whether or not they have to offer one or not. I don't know what makes that difference. But only my job at the school district offered a 401k, and I imagine that's because it was a government job. I don't know. Whereas here, you have the superannuation, and it used to be 11.5%. It just, as of July 1st, got bumped up to 12%. So in addition to your salary, has to pay into your superannuation account, which is basically an investment retirement account, IRA, 12% of your pay additionally, like on top of whatever your pay rate is, into this account. And you can't touch it till you're like 65, 68, whatever it is. And that's every employer across the board. Doesn't matter if you're a minimum wage worker at McDonald's or a CEO. Like, you have to get paid into a superannuation fund. It's legally mandated. Every employer has to do it. And I've heard some critiques and criticisms of the superannuation system, but I genuinely think it's one of the best, ideas any country has ever had. A forced retirement savings account, it automatically is getting invested. Like I said, I worked at one place. I had my 401k. I cashed it out because I was like, oh, I'd rather just have the money, so I cashed it out, paid the penalty fee, whatever it was. There is no mechanism, especially as a non-citizen. I think citizens have some ways to tap into their superannuation funds for like medical emergencies or things like that, but as a non-citizen, I do not have any mechanism to touch the money in that account. All I get to do is pick what sort of investment strategy it has, so I'm going like index diversified and high risk, just based on my age. But like I said, like, you know, I got my, when I was in my 20s, I got my 401k, and when I left that job, I just cashed it out because I wanted the money, and I wasn't investing it, and I had like a Vanguard account or whatever, but there wasn't much going on with that. With this, it's like mandatory, 12% on top of every paycheck goes into there every week. And it's growing. I already have thousands of dollars in there, which is, you know, more than I ever had in a 401k by a long shot. And like, it just keeps growing, and I can't touch it. It's just gonna keep growing with the market. And I think that's one of the smartest things, like a forced retirement savings investment account for all citizens. So everyone has that money, and that's, in Australia still has a pension as well, so you can still collect your pension as well as cash out your superannuation. So there's like multiple financial safety nets, and you get to retirement age. Or you kind of look at what's happening in the United States, and all employees, all workers are paying into Social Security. And there's questions about like whether or not people in my generation are even going to have any Social Security left to cash out. Like, people have been paying into the system their entire working lives, and they might not even be able to see the benefits of it, and it's just a total scam, and the government should have never been allowed to tap into Social Security. Whereas your super funds in there, it's, you know, lock and key, you're not touching it, and I think that's great. And also the workers' rights here are so much better. I don't know how it is for every job, but at my job, I had a 6-month probation period. Like I said, I've been there for a year. So, because of like Australian workers' rights, whatever, as soon as I passed my 6-month probation period, it is now illegal for my employer to fire me without a justified cause. There's like a list of things of what a justified cause can be. And now coming from, you know, I've worked in, what's the not right to work or at will, or I can't remember the exact term for it, but basically I've worked in a state where your employer does not have to have a reason to fire you. They can just fire you for no reason. They don't have to give you a warning. Any of that stuff. But the way it works here is they can't fire me, but they can make me redundant. They can make my role redundant. But legally, they have to allow me to work in a different role in the company that I'm qualified for. So let's say if I get fired from this role, but there's another job, like doing something else, I can work that job instead if they make my role redundant. And there's also like a window, so I think for me, I have like a 2-week window. So like, if I am made redundant, and or my role is made redundant, it's not the person, it's the role, like that's, or whatever. And I decide I don't want to, keep working there, I want to look at a different job. They have to pay me out 2 weeks they keep paying me for 2 weeks after I leave. And that goes up the more that you've worked at a place. I was talking actually to the COO, the Chief Operations Officer, and she was saying that she knows somebody that their role was made redundant and they had worked there for I think 15 or 16 years or something, and they got paid out like, I think she said like 14 months. So she left that company, she was gone, but they had to keep paying her for 14 months because of how long she'd worked there. And you accrue things like long service leave. I don't like, so like, it's just the amount of leave you get in general is so much more, because I know in the States people talk all the time, like, and obviously I knew as well, because if you know me, if you watch my channel, you know I love traveling, I love seeing different places, but it would take you forever to start getting that annual leave, and once you do, is, 2-3 weeks max. You get so much more leave here. I have one of my coworkers, she took 2 weeks off to go to Bali in January. It was either right before or right after Christmas, either middle, early December, or early January. She took 2 weeks off to get to Bali. And she's already accrued enough paid leave between then and now, and she's taking 3 weeks off to go to Japan next month. That's 5 weeks of holidays, and through August, and then she'll, have some more for end of the year, Christmas, all that stuff. I have one coworker, she's taking 6 weeks off to go to Italy. Like, there's somebody who used their long service leave. They took 3 months off of their long service leave. They're like, you know what, I was long service leave, I'm just gonna be gone for 3 months. And like, they can't refuse that, it's no questions asked. And I think like, I know people who've worked at places in the States for years and years and years and years, and they've either never taken a vacation, or the longest vacation they've taken is like 1 week, 2 weeks. It's like that, and it's like, you're living to work. You're not working to live, and it's just a completely different mindset. And it feels so much healthier, it's so refreshing, and like genuinely, I feel so much happier and healthier. Like, I'm happy to go to work every day. Like, I go in, I'm like excited to be there, I'm talking to my coworkers, like, yeah, let's get stuff done, or you feel like there's the trade-off is there, not being taken advantage of, or, it might just be the workplaces I had in the States, and, maybe, everyone's experience is different, but I was never happy and excited going into work, back home, and it just feels like a totally different world, and you look at it and you're like, man, like, I love the U.S., like, I recognize that it does have its problems, and, but I love it, and I love what it stands for, the concept, the idea of the United States. So it's like, one thing that the United States has always struggled with is admitting when we're wrong, and it's like, man, when it comes to this whole work culture, and built off, like, the Protestant work ethic, like, I think we got this one wrong, like, I think we need to adjust a little bit here. And one last little bit, because I guess this is a tertiary piece of information, but I actually have one of my really good friends, one of my best friends, he moved from Florida to Mexico. So he He now lives full-time in Mexico City, Mexico. And he said, like, you know, the work, he works in a pharmaceutical, so he was a pharmacist in Florida, and now he's a pharmacist in Mexico City. And he's like, you know, our lunch break is 2 hours, sometimes 3. Like the siestas, you know, people move at their own pace. He's like, you know, back home it was like, you have that 30-minute lunch break, and if you're not precisely, you know, there, like, people start asking questions. Or he's like, you know, his whole entire office, they close the door. They're like, oh, sorry, we're closed, roll out at lunch. And there's no return time on that. They're out, they're eating. They'll have, you know, 1, 2, 3 courses. And they're like, oh, we're done eating? Yeah, let's go open the pharmacy back up. And, like, that's it. And it's like, maybe you don't have to go to that extreme, but I don't know, I feel like in the States, you know, I've seen so many people just working themselves to death, working themselves, and it's like, man, like, what's the point? And because here, you know, I still feel like you have a bit of that. It's more American, what my friend's experiencing in Mexico, but there's still the legal regulations, the safety nets that, you know, are protecting employees instead of employers. And like, it feels like the labor force, the workforce, the employees are always the focus and the beneficiaries to the regulation and the laws, instead of the employers being the focus and the beneficiaries of the laws. But anyways, that's just been my experience 1 year working here. Who knows, it might change if I end up, you know, moving jobs to a different workplace, who knows. But if you've had any experience, if you're an American that has worked outside the United States and you've found the experience one way or another, I'd love to hear your comments down below. If you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for